Michael, thank you so much for being with us today. In this session, we want to talk about a major problem that we see around AI, how to monetize artificial intelligence and especially generative AI. So Michael, let's start directly with the big problem. What's going on in this field?
That's a great question. And let me go back just for a second, because to talk about the problem, I just want to describe a bit, what happened. So last year, I had the chance to actually review about 70 generative AI offers and really, tear down their pricing and monetization models. So if I just give you a quick perspective, right? Last year, roughly 85% of offers were not monetized. Of course, it changed across the course of the year. I did the study around March 2024. The second thing, which was interesting, is that most of the offers, when they were monetized, were actually monetized as let me call that almost like a sidecar, like an add-on or something on the side. So really three ways. In some case, it was inclusive and, a customer would pay for a price increase, let's say. So that was, for example, Canva, right? They included GenAI and you had to pay a bit more. Adobe did a bit of the same as well, indirectly. It could be sold as an add-on. So Notion AI, for example, was sold as an add-on for any edition, including the free edition, or it was sold as a super tier. Think of it as you have enterprise and it becomes enterprise plus AI. And that was, for example, Box. But what's interesting, Fabien, based on your question, is the fact that for the vast majority, it was not monetized. And when it was monetized, it was seen as a byproduct or a new feature. We'll see the difference now with agentic AI in a minute. What was interesting as well is we already saw that shift, which we'll discuss, away from user. We had less than half of the companies having user as the sole pricing metric, right? And you probably know that user has been one of the core pricing metric for software since pretty much personal computers, let's say 40 years ago. Even in SaaS, it's been used. And what was really interesting was the fact that there was so many iterations, including when I was writing the study. We had, for example, GitHub adding 2 then 3 tiers. We had Intercom actually introducing for their customer service platform a very innovative outcome-based per resolution model. So a lot of changes. We're going to go into the mistakes in a second, but let me just not tell you what's happening, right? Which is agentic AI. With agentic AI, what's happened is the fact that it's building on GenAI, obviously, but GenAI, as I mentioned, was a sidecar because it worked with the user. It was pretty much reactive. It was focused on the output. It was very much focused on indirect productivity gains. It was contained internally. Again, which explains why it was monetized as a feature. But now, enters agentic AI. Agentic AI works on behalf of the user. It's proactive. It's goal-orientated. It's really displacing workflows instead of just generating productivity gains. And it's interconnected, right, with the new protocols, agent to agent, ACP, MCP, and AMP. So for a very nascent technology, it's quite impressive. So the mistake, which is your question, comes from the very specific nature of agentic and GenAI, right? You have usually this triangle of needing to balance costs, value, and adoption. The value is immense. If I just give you again the examples of customer support, development support, we see in the 20, 30, 40, even 50% of improvement of the process. So that's a very different magnitude and dynamic of the value. And the value is created directly by the tool instead of being created by the team implementing the tool and the customer itself. Adoption, we saw that it was free. That was one mistake, by the way, for sure. Free was a mistake. And last was cost. And that's where, in fact, I'm going to answer your question now, which is the mistake, in fact, comes from the cost. The cost in generative AI and even more so is in agentic, the cost is by design very different. Let me try to use very simple images. In SaaS, for decades, we have known a product that was, plateauing in terms of costs. So whenever you, Fabien, for example, you use SaaS, the fact that there's 1, 2, 3,000, there's going to be a bit of a scale effect. But then if it's 1,000 and 1,000 and hundreds, it's almost the same cost, right? Yeah. So it's expensive to build, but it's almost cheap to run. AI is the exact opposite, right? It goes fast to build, but every single inference costs money and it's almost linear. So first mistake, right, is that companies still price on users. And that was half of companies. And why it's a mistake? It's a bit like the gym club. When you go to the gym, they make money based on people, unfortunately, not going to the gym and paying a subscription. If you do that with AI, then you're going to start making money on the people that uses the less and those that get the least value. So the very first mistake is pricing per user, because it would yield the worst margins on the people who benefit the most from your tools, which is not a good incentive. The second mistake is pricing per user. Again, why? Because AI value typically scales in a different way than the number of users using it, if not quite the opposite. When you use GenAI or agents, you probably need the same amount of people and probably a lot less users as you deploy, because you're going to displace part or some of the workflow. So in fact, think of it, you're shooting yourself in the foot. First mistake once by pricing per user because of the margin. And second, you're shooting yourself in the second foot because it actually doesn't scale with the value you create, right? Because you can have less users. So that's why, just to answer your question, right? We see GenAI and agentic AI having, just because of that different cost dynamic, on average, a margin which is 20 points lower as compared to SaaS. Good news, right now it's about 37% of companies in AI that are monetizing mainly based on users. That means it's becoming a minority. It was the rule, right? Price per user. And now it's actually becoming the exception.
It's so funny because we had this discussion together. So obviously we already know that a lot of companies are not really good in like pricing and monetization. That was a fact.
Absolutely.
Now, on top of that, what you're adding, it's like you need someone who understands monetization and pricing, and you need someone who understands like AI, generative AI, discriminative AI, which is very, very scarce. I know everybody on LinkedIn is an expert in AI, but the reality, it's like very few people understand that. And it's very interesting because I really see kind of like this really problem about talent. It's like, who can understand AI? Who can understand monetization? And you take those very scarce resources and try to mix them. That's a big problem.
Absolutely.
So maybe good transition, because so we went right in. Can you maybe give a quick introduction on who you are, little background maybe?
Absolutely. I'm Michael Mansard. I'm the principal director and the EMEA chair of the Subscribe Institute at Zuora. It's a think tank. We have about 1,500 members, globally. I've been working myself in monetization for 15 years, and I've worked with more than 400 companies across the globe from pretty much all size and industries. I would say a subscription and usage-based model nerd. So outside of Zuora, I'm also a happy investor and advisory board member. And I also teach at INSEAD, which is a super nice business school that I love, where I co-created what's called the Subscription Business Bootcamp with Professor Ulaga for executive MBAs and executive education. So that's what I do in a nutshell.
That's awesome. You are quite busy, Michael.
Can't complain.
So maybe to come back on the topic, and when we prepared this session, we talked about like what we've seen in AI. And again, I've seen the pricing of AI changing quite a lot. And again, for everybody, we need to really create a big distinction between the traditional AI, what we call discriminative AI, which is mostly machine learning.
Yes.
And again, it's more the traditional SaaS model. And then again, 2017, the transformers released by the Google research team, then applied by the OpenAI team, leading to ChatGPT, and then now all the different generative AI tools, creating those concepts of like LLMs and LLMs enriched solutions, creating a lot of new ways of creating businesses. And I think in this space, everybody wants to go there. Almost nobody understands the technology. So everybody is kind of like learning on the fly. And then on top of that, you need to understand your monetization strategy. And Michael, you did a lot of work, and thank you so much for what you've done. And I think you are pretty close to understand kind of like what is the best in class to really monetize Gen AI based solutions.
Absolutely. So let me step back for a second. And I like what you said, right? Which is companies are learning on the fly, but they're also learning monetization on the fly. Everybody, I would say most people now understand, and I've been working on that for more than a year. And it's actually started, by the way, with the consumption or usage-based model also in SaaS, before even AI, which is about 67% of companies right now doing it in some shape or form. Why it's interesting, right? It's the market. We're talking about a 6 billion market today for the new AI that you mentioned. Depending on the analysts, some say it's maybe 35%, some say it's 45%, some 50%. But let's say it's going to grow very fast, and it should reach $200 billion. And a lot of it is going to be linked to the fact that there's going to be displacement from SaaS budgets to AI budgets. So it's staying for sure. There's going to be hiccups for sure. But to capture $200 billion or the $100 billion, then you need to understand what's next. What's interesting is because of the tremendous amount of value that AI is generating, there's a lot more ability to actually capture a bigger share of value in AI as compared to SaaS. In SaaS, you typically capture 5, 10, 15, at best 20%. That's going to be a lot more in agentic AI specifically because actually it does the work. So now I think we all understand that, which is the conclusion before I introduce the different models, as you asked. Even though people know that you need to move beyond user, the question is what's next, which I will describe in a second. But what's important is even though in SaaS, monetization was critical. In AI, because of the unique cost dynamic and magnitude I mentioned, it's a matter of survival. So some company can actually die by making incorrect monetization choices. So now, what's the palette, right? If you're a painter, things the different colors on the palette. And really, I try to summarize it as a spectrum. Right? It's not discrete, it's continuous, but let's try to assess discrete values. I see 4 of them, and I'm going to try to draw parallels in real life just to show that, in fact, it's nothing really new. It's different, for sure, but it's always existed in some shapes or form. So the first model is what I call per agent access, where you actually pay for the work capacity of the agents, regardless if it's working or not working. So it's very similar in real life to a salary or a consultant retainer. And you have companies like Newlify, for example, that charge you, let's say, $800 per developer per year. Maybe it has changed since then, but this was at least a valid example. Now, the next step is if you have agent access, you could restrict this access and only charge for effective work, which is the second level, which is agentic activity. And in that case, the real life example would be per hour advisory or time and material project. And the 2 of the best examples I know would be Hippocratic AI, which is a virtual agentic nurse, and they charge you $10 or $9, let's say, per hour per agent. So it's you're effectively displacing or replacing an actual consultation, if you will. The second interesting example would be Devin. Devin, it's a coding agent, and they charge you, I think, something like $2 something per agent computing units. What's interesting is that I put both in terms of activity, but you can already see, Fabien, that they're on different part of the spectrum. Per agent computing activity is almost like token. Per hour is a bit more advanced because it's a sum of token. Again, going back to the fact that it's not the discrete, it's a continuous spectrum. But then the activity actually can combine into producing finite output. And in that case, you pay per the action or the deliverable, which again, in real life has been existed for a very long time. Think of companies working in the space of payroll. They actually charge you per pay sheet that they produce. So that'd be a usage-based or volume-based business process outsourcing contract. And here, a classic example would be Agentforce that charges you 20 credits per conversation and a credits per action, and that's roughly 10 cents per action today. Or Decagon, which is a customer support platform, and they charge you per conversation as a first option. Remember that. First, that's one of the options. But then, of course, the output can combine in order to drive results and impact, which can be operational or strategic. And in that case, you pay for the agentic outcome, which is the performance. In real life, that's a typical performance-based business process outsourcing contract that, for example, you see in cost-cutting services. You take a consulting firm, they cut the cost, and they take a percentage of that. Guess what? In agents, you have a company like Vantage. They have a copilot for AWS spend, for example, and they take, for example, 5% of the savings. Or Decagon, that I mentioned earlier, they actually also have a model where they charge you per customer ticket resolution, not conversation, effective resolution. So now, Fabien, what's interesting is 2 things. One is the fact that there's no dominant models. So the biggest chunk of companies right now are between agentic and output. They represent something like 75% of the 65 offers I studied. The second learning I'm going to tell you, which is directly linked to this one, is you have a lot of AI experts these days on LinkedIn teams, but you also have a lot of monetization expertise teams on LinkedIn. And everybody talks about outcome being the holy grail or the panacea. I treat it as sure, in some cases, if you can, but only a minority of companies can actually charge for outcome. And many people do not really understand what outcome is, right? Which is an actual tangible business, strategic, or operational results. And that's why it's only 10% of offers today. I don't think it's going to go north of 20% in the next years or so. And I just would conclude on one thing, Fabien, before probably we can describe about how to pick the metric then. But the last thing I'm going to tell you is, when you look at the numbers, about let's say, to keep it simple, about 75% of CIOs right now do not want to buy per user per seat, which is perfect because it goes in the right direction. But the second thing is that only 12 to 15 points of the 75, right? Roughly 75, 77, let's say, of the CIOs want to buy outcomes. So not only it's not the panacea, but the buyer, in most cases, are not yet ready to buy outcomes. Why? 3 simple reasons. First one, it's really hard to justify the attributability of value. You created this and I and the customer accept it. Second, it's really hard sometimes to measure the outcome because of the length, because again of the attributability. And third, it's really hard to sometimes predict or forecast as a buyer and a seller the outcome as compared to something more granular like an action, for example.
And actually to share about what we've seen at Sparkwise solution by Dr. Carlisle, it's we try to go into the outcome-based model. And I think like 99% of the case, our clients are like, you know what? It's great that you are so confident about what you do, but we are not comfortable with this approach. So they kind of, back down and go back to the traditional kind of like model. So yeah, I think nobody or very few companies are ready to go into the agentic outcome. And it's the same thing. I remember at the early days when we started to think about like generative AI and like the early days of Gemini when I was at Google, we tried to go to see some clients and say, you know what, we will fund some project and let's try and maybe, we can partner up on the outcome. And it was the same things. And I think Google, OpenAI, the big tech company, did something very smart. They went away. They understand that in this cold AI rush, they are just giving you the electricity. So it's like they're acting as an energy network. So they are like competing with like Consumer Energy from the US or like EDF in France. And I think that's very smart because it seems not too complex, but that's the best way of actually maximizing your margin. One thing you mentioned, Salesforce and Agentforce, because I think they did, a lot of marketing about we go to the outcome, and they went very aggressive with Agentforce saying like, you will pay actually kind of outcome. And they recently moved away from this model. Can you maybe share a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Before I do that, I'd like to introduce a tool because, I love to dissect the moves using tools instead of intuition, even though both are useful. Let's step back just for a second also to remember the importance of a pricing metric, right? Because right now I said, look, you have to choose the right pricing metric and introduce the tools. But if we step back, just 2 quick stories, right? First one is VMware. VMware, for those who know, they provide virtualization solutions, quite famous around the 2010, 2008 period. They actually moved back then in 2012 to a VRAM pricing model. They used to price based on the CPU socket, and they moved to virtual server memory. The problem was it was really hard to forecast. And at the same time, it incentivized customers to inefficiently use the servers to optimize the costs. There was massive steep hikes, sometimes more than 100%, sometimes a lot more. And it was decorrelated from the value. And as a result, there was a massive backlash. And they had to go back to the initial model, CEO had to step down and so on. So choosing the wrong pricing metric can have disastrous impact. But on the other hand, it can be a massive opportunity. Segment that I think was acquired by Twilio. It's a customer data platform. They actually, back in the day, charge per inbound events, right? So they take the inbound event and they distribute it to different platforms. The pricing model was focused on ingestion, but the core value of the model was distribution of that value. And that means that the price model didn't match the value, and it was also hard to forecast against. They pivoted to a monthly tracked user metric that was about 2016, 17-ish. And that was a massive contributor of their growth. And in fact, they signaled this to the market and other competitors actually moved to that model. So again, a pricing model can have an outsized impact on your business. So going to that point, hopefully, Fabien and the people who are listening, you understand that you have these 4 archetypes on the spectrum of agentic. Now the question becomes, which one do you pick? Which was, of course, the question that Salesforce was asking themselves and is asking themselves for Agentforce, which was your question. So I developed a series of 2 tools within what I call the Compass framework. Why Compass? You'll see there's a small pun. It describes agentic monetization and so on in the name. I'll let you read it from the LinkedIn post. So there's 2 tools. The first tool, which is linked to the theme of Compass, is a matrix that tells you which pricing typology you should use across the 4, depending on your agent scope of work, and the level of attributability of value. So if you think of navigation, it helps you navigate, which corridors you could be using or which destination you should be heading to, right? So again, I won't describe the tool now. You can read the article, but essentially the conclusion is, of course, outcome only works for a very small set of companies that can have goal achievements as part of their agent or agents work, and who can have direct and strong attributability of value. That's why, for example, we see that most of the companies that can be in that category are solutions that typically were done by a human in the past, obviously, but through business process outsourcing contracts, meaning that the buyer, which was your point, Fabien, by the way, was educated already into buying outcome, but from a human team. So in fact, it's just old wine, new bottles, essentially. So that matrix, which is a 3x3 matrix that I invite you to read, helps you decide if you should be per agent, per activity, per output, per outcome. The second tool of the framework is a list of 7 categories of themes that you need to understand and 14 questions, 2 per the 7 categories you need to ask and score. So probably you'll be able to share during the webinar the actual tear down of the pricing. So I actually took the actual Agentforce pricing, which in September 2024 was $2 per conversation, which pivoted then in May 2025 into the flex credit model per action. So they charge you per action, as I mentioned, through a pack of prepaid credits. So I used the framework, the 14 questions, and I used a scoring mechanism. I actually used AI to do the scoring, so I was not biased. It was not my opinion, at least. And there's some interesting things. So just to give you a sense of the questions that are part of the framework. Does the metric grow in the same direction as value delivery? Does it grow at the same speed? Because if it doesn't go in the same direction, you're losing money. If it goes not at the same speed, you're overcharging or undercharging the client. Do you have a clear linkage between your solution and the value you create? Can your customer forecast against the metric? Can it lead to some level of commitments? So there's 14 questions, which I won't describe now, but as you can imagine, it's built not just for AI, it's been built upon, multiple decades of experience from myself and a good friend, Steven Force, who's the CEO of Ibaka. So we built that framework and actually used it, and we use it on about 40 companies. Some scored extremely high, for example, Fin, which is a customer service platform, but I also did it for Agentforce, and I compared the old and the new pricing. And to your conclusion, Fabien, it's interesting. Technically, they actually went backward on the spectrum because an action is more granular than a conversation, because a conversation is, amongst others, sum of action. However, it scores better amongst all the dimensions except one, which I will describe. Why? Let me try to give you the rationale. If you charge per conversation, the problem is that you assume that all the conversations have the same value. However, if it's an HR internal conversation around, let's say, payroll versus a customer-facing conversation that leads to a pipeline conversion, the value of this conversation is very different. $2 is cheap for the sales one, $2 is expensive for the HR one. So there was no homogeneity of value, which probably linked to endless conversations with the clients. Now, if you move to per action, it's more granular, but people can fathom what is an action and can understand that an action, by the way, which can be updating a CRM record or creating a task for a sales rep. You can say it has always the same value because it could have been done by someone in my organization, for example. So long story short, per action is less advanced on the spectrum, but paradoxically rank higher. The only places where it might rank a bit less higher or lower, in fact, than conversation is the forecastability, because it's easier to forecast the number of conversations one may have because you probably already measure it. The action resulting for the conversation is a bit harder to forecast. That's why probably they went into packs of prepaid credits, at the same time also allowing through agreements to swap users for agentic credits. So it enables also Salesforce to tap into the CIO innovation budget for AI. Make sense?
Absolutely. Do you have any advice for the audience on what they should do or what they should not do maybe?
So of course, let me put it this way. My conclusion has to be taken with a grain of salt. First off, there's going to be an explosion of new business models and revenue models for sure. No one's going to know the metric. So my recommendation would be first, be obsessed by the client and spend time with the client and ask the questions and even use my framework with your clients to co-design the right metric. Metric is not price. Metric is a value discussion with your client. Invest in building value models so you can articulate the value, because you have to be two to tango on the value dance, with your customer. You will have multiple model coexisting, by the way. And the last piece is, I would say, the role of the CFO. It's not a product. It's not a marketing discussion. It's becoming a CFO discussion, by the way, also. And because of the nature of cost, the nature of value, I think the CFO role should encompass a lot more of the pricing responsibilities moving forward in AI. And last piece, which is you will also need, and I'm sorry, I'm at Zuora, so I have to talk about it for sure, the need for monetization platform. So monetization is becoming extremely complicated. And if you want to scale and not be the office of no, as a CFO, product, or whatever role you have, you need to invest in a platform that helps you scale and prepare the future. Because in fact, the truth is, no one knows where it's headed or where it's heading. So you have to be in a position where you can try pretty much anything.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Michael. I think it's mission accomplished. We are below 30 minutes. So thank you so much. It was a great session.
Brilliant. And feel free to connect on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to share. I like to nerd out on frameworks and stuff, and pretty closely connected with you, Fabien. So more than happy to connect and continue the crazy discussions about where AI monetization is headed.